Can I ask the Minister to report on his meeting reported with the Irish Properties Owners Association in view of rising rents, in view of the homeless crisis, the plans on addressing the rising rents, the rent crisis for people. I understand reference at the Labour Party conference was made to something approaching rent controls, but referred to as rent certainty rather than rent controls. Perhaps more detail could be provided on that. Any plans to increase the rights of tenants, because that's clearly a major factor, the absence of a legal framework providing security of tenure for tenants. And there's also been some discussion around the tax treatment of rental income.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, the meeting which Minister Kelly held with the Irish Property Association was part of consultations with my department in having a range of stakeholders in relation to the development of legislative proposals. In that context, the Association raised certain issues of interest to it, including the taxation treatment of landlords and the housing standards for rented houses regulations. Fundamentally, the main cause of rising rents is a lack of supply in the market, and the implementation of a range of actions under the Government's Construction 2020 strategy will support increased housing supply. In addition, the Social Housing Strategy 2020, published in November of last year, sets out clear, measurable actions and targets to increase the supply of social housing reform, delivery arrangements and meet the housing needs of all households on the waiting list. Also, Deputy, the report Rent Stability in the Private Rented Sector, commissioned by the PRTB and published in autumn of last year, includes an examination of rent regulation regimes in other countries and puts forward a series of policy options in relation to rent stability for consideration. These include options in relation to rent regulation, as well as measures aimed at increasing awareness of tenants' rights under existing legislation. I will say that the Government is monitoring the rent market closely, and we are currently considering a number of policy options in relation to achieving greater rent certainty. The options put forward in the Rent Stability in the Private Sector report that I referred to form part of these considerations. So therefore, the Government's overriding objective in relation to rents is to achieve stability and sustainability in the market for the benefit of tenants, landlords and society as a whole.
Paul Murphy.
Thank you. I think that the Government underestimates the seriousness of this problem. I mean, this is not something that can just be waited and let's wait to build houses at the slow rate that is actually talked about in the Government's housing strategy. Right now, according to the CSO, almost a third of people rent. They're faced with rent increases of over 10% in Dublin, obviously in the last year. There was a recent report by NABCO which said that 23% of all tenants are afraid of losing their home. That's reflected in the calls that I get in my office, I'm sure other people get, of people being bullied by landlords, pushing them out in order to increase rents for others. The figures are worst for those who are on low incomes, where 45% are afraid of losing their home. 1/3 of tenants don't know whether they have a formal lease. Only 7% identify themselves as having a Part 4 tenancy. Action is needed on this now, and action could be taken, and central to that is rent controls. We don't need temporary rent controls. We don't need temporary rent controls in certain areas. We need rent controls, as exist in many other European and developed countries, to limit the kind of profiteering that is going on at the expense of generally low-paid workers.
Thank you, Minister.
Can I assure the Deputy that this Government certainly doesn't underestimate the problem, and we recognise that there is a pent-up demand, and we are doing what we can to address that. And to do that, we need to adopt strategies. And as I have already outlined, the Social Housing Strategy 2020 and the Construction Strategy 2020 is addressing in a multifaceted way the delivery of more units for the people that need them, and to take away and meet the demand that's there. Unless we do that, unless we increase the supply of houses that's available, rent will always be a problem in this country. The Government has already announced how it will invest heavily in the delivery of extra units. We are prioritising and front-loading the refurbishment of voids in the main urban centres to try and relieve some of the pressure, and a number of housing projects and allocations will be announced very shortly to further enhance that. With regard to rent control that you speak about, Deputy, and the PRTB report refers to it, research shows that crude rent caps lead to a reduction in the supply of rental units. So we need to be very careful here that whatever measures or interventions government makes doesn't reduce what we all know is needed, and that's an increased supply in this area.
Thank you, Minister. We'll come back to the Minister. Deputy Murphy.
In the real world, rent controls and rent caps do not lead to a decrease in supply. That exists in the world of neoliberal economists who simply look at supply and demand charts. But that's not actually how it happens. Landlords are landlords and act as landlords as long as they can make an amount of money which can be made, including with rent controls. I mean, rising rents are a key factor in the homelessness crisis. 52 people, according to Mike Allen, were made homeless in January as a result of rising rents. Threshold has repeatedly identified rising rents as the key factor in terms of driving homelessness. In terms of the question of an increase in supply, I mean, I agree that we need an increase of supply of housing in the housing market. But I mean, what the Minister said earlier, and he said it repeatedly, that this is the biggest house building programme in the state. I mean, it's just not true when measured by houses, which is surely the only way you can measure it. If you look at the strategy, from 35,000 additional social units, 11,000 more units are leased, i.e. rented from private landlords. Almost 2,500 are refurbished voids, and that leaves about 22,500 which will be built or bought, which is a rate of just under 4,000 units per year. That is not the biggest house building programme in the state. It's a small house building programme. You compare it to the 70s, the 80s, when you had 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 homes built in a year, or at earlier stages. That is not enough, as is the absence of moving on rent controls to actually deal with these crises.
Thank you. Minister, to conclude.
Can I just say that, as I said at the outset, the strategies that the Government is currently pursuing is showing an increase in the supply of units, and we expect that to increase substantially over the coming year. Can I also say that this is a multifaceted approach, and you're right that we do need to protect tenants when they're in their homes, and that is why the PRTB and Threshold have a protocol now that will assist people where they're under threat of having to leave their home. So that is working around the country. Also, community welfare officers have discretion through the Department of Social Protection to assist people that are under pressure with regards to their rent on a case-by-case basis. Also, the PRTB are currently undertaking a national awareness campaign with regard to tenants' rights, because often tenants are leaving homes unnecessarily due to pressure that's there, and I think it behoves all of us as public representatives to ensure that tenants are fully aware of their rights and to ensure that they are protected as far as possible under current legislation. Can I state again, Government is considering all options. We are looking at measures to try and introduce rent certainty, but at the end of the day, the housing market must be normalised so that we create stability within the market, and more importantly sustainability, so that people can remain in their homes at affordable rates. Thank you.